it seems to me that to attack Hamas by destroying the whole of the housing stock of a country and inflicting casualties on potentially the entire population is entirely disproportionate.
Let's discuss what's happening with Gaza. There's a number of interesting comment pieces this week about the situation in Gaza. Writing in today's Sunday Times, the columnist Matthew Said has talked about Israel's actions in Gaza, fueling what he describes as a new wave of radicalisation and acting as a recruitment drive for Hamas. And this, of course, comes amid almost daily reports of Palestinians being killed while seeking aid and food distribution centres being run by US and Israel-backed this operation called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, something that we discussed on this show yesterday. Now, Lord Jonathan Sumption, who is a historian, he's a former British Supreme Court Justice. He's also written a very interesting essay in the New Statesman as well. And he says, look, I take no ideological position, but, and we'll speak to him in a moment, he says he feels that what's happening is, in short, a war crime. And I'm delighted that Lord Sumption joins us now. Lord Sumption, thanks very much for speaking to us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Just tell us outline the thoughts that you set out in your essay about what you think is happening in Gaza now.
Well, first of all, we've had hospitals and other facilities essential for the survival of civilian life attacked. We've had indiscriminate attacks on civilian property. 92% of the housing stock of Gaza, as at January of this year, has been either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable by damage. And currently, according to recent reports over the last few days, demolition squads in Israeli service are engaged in demolishing the rest. This has been said by Prime Minister Netanyahu in an interview with a Knesset committee to have it as its object to ensure that Gazans have nowhere to return to after the present crisis. It's part of a movement to displace, ideally, the whole, but certainly a large part of the population of Gaza to third countries. All of this, together with the blocking of humanitarian aid, except through the tame Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, seems to me to be very serious convention breaches. Israel is a party to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which contains extensive protections for civilian life. Attacks on hospitals are absolutely out unless those hospitals are themselves being used to carry on the war. Attacks on civilian property, which target civilian property, are out. Displacement of wholesale populations are out. Now, these rules are a tremendous achievement of our time. They have intended to turn the page on some of the more atrocious acts of both sides in the Second World War. The systematic disregard of these rules seems to me to be a very serious accusation against Israel, but there seems to be very little doubt that is what's happening.
And so, having considered all of this, do you think Israel is committing war crimes?
Yes, I do. I think it's absolutely plain that they are. One of the fundamental rules of international humanitarian law, which is the body of customary law governing the conduct of military operations, one of the fundamental rules is that however necessary in military terms some operation may be, it is not permitted if it produces effects on the civilian population which are disproportionate to the military value. It seems to me that a situation in which almost the entire housing stock of Gaza, homes to 2 million people, are being systematically destroyed is disproportionate. It seems to me that the deaths of some 60,000 people, most of whom are civilians, and indeed most of whom are women and children, cannot be described as a proportionate response to any threat facing Israel.
Now, and many of my listeners will say, look, this is all terrible, but this is what happens in a war. And ultimately, Israel had the right to self-defense after those horrendous attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, a huge loss of Jewish life in Israel. What would you say to that?
Well, I entirely agree that the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October 2023 were horrendous and completely unforgivable. But although it's absolutely right that Israel has a right of self-defense, the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law limit the methods that can be used to exercise that right. And it doesn't matter whose fault it is, it doesn't matter who started it. These rules apply so as to provide at least a partial element of civilization to the conduct of warfare. So I reject the suggestion that I've often heard, which you've just quoted.
And of course, a follow-up criticism of what you would say, and I'm sure some of my listeners will start messaging in saying, you know, you giving Lord Sumption this time, you're just helping Hamas, you're parroting Hamas talking points. What would you say to those people?
Well, Hamas is a terrorist organization. I don't think there's the slightest doubt about that. And it's an organization whose objectives and methods are completely contemptible. But it seems to me that to attack Hamas by destroying the whole of the housing stock of a country and inflicting casualties on potentially the entire population is entirely disproportionate. To attack Hamas, which is a group which is essentially dispersed among the population, is, as I suggested in my article, it's like trying to attack or take out needles in a haystack. You can only do it by destroying the entire haystack. And that is, each shard of grain in that haystack is a human life. Proportionality has an important role in the conduct of civilized states.
And so, in your view, do you feel that what Israel is doing amounts to collective damage and collective punishment for what happened on the 7th of October?
I do. I think that is reasonably plain from public statements which have been made by senior cabinet ministers in Mr. Netanyahu's government. Shortly after the decision was made to launch the current operations against Gaza in May of this year, a cabinet minister said that the object was entirely to destroy Gaza. Subsequently, there have been blood-curdling statements by those cabinet ministers who believe in ethnic cleansing. The British government, together with 4 other governments, has imposed sanctions on 2 of those cabinet ministers, ostensibly in their personal capacity. But remember that these 2 people, Mr. Ben Gvir and Mr. Smotrich, are the leaders of minority parties in the Knesset, on whom Mr. Netanyahu's government depends for its survival. So the cabinet itself cannot depart too far from their inflammatory views. It seems to me that they are condemned by their own public statements.
Lord Sumption, we're getting a couple of messages in pushing back against what you're saying. I'll just read out one and maybe you could respond to one of our listeners, Tony. He says, Tony here, Gaza is appalling, but why do people like Lord Sumption quite rightly speak out for Gazan people, but are quite happy to sit back while Putin slaughters Ukrainian people with no comment? The same for the Free Palestine mob. What would you say to Tony?
I entirely reject the suggestion that people like me have sat back while Putin permits war crimes in Ukraine. I entirely agree with Tony that there have been very serious Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And in my article, what I pointed out was that it would be hypocritical for us to condemn, as we have done, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine and to stand by while the Israelis do much the same sort of thing in Gaza.
Another Tony has messaged in, very much agreeing with you, saying what is happening in Gaza is appalling and we should all be ashamed. We watch the scenes on television every day, wring our hands and say, oh, well, there, but for the grace of God I go, never mind, that is not a good enough. And that's from a different Tony. Another listener, loads of messages coming in, Jonathan. Another listener says, Lord Sumption was a hero to me, no more. Hamas only had to return the hostages and accuses you of being an anti-Semite. What would you say to that, Lord Sumption?
Well, as to the suggestion that I'm an anti-Semite, I certainly reject the idea that it is impossible to criticise Israel's conduct without being anti-Semitic. I would take exactly the same view if it was done by any other state, including a state which is not a Jewish state. I have, in fact, taken exactly the same view, as I've said, about the Russians' behaviour in Ukraine.
And we have another listener, Sue, saying it's so good to hear somebody speaking so clearly and precisely about what is going on in Gaza. It is so clear that Israel wants to make it impossible for Gazans to live in Gaza so that their settlers can take over the whole of the Gaza Strip. Why is our government not speaking out? Why is the world not speaking out to condemn Israel? What has been perpetrated on the population in Gaza is pure wickedness. And I suppose that leads on to my next question, Lord Sumption. You're a very senior, well-established historian and obviously legal expert. You in this article, and you're arguing here that you think that this is collective punishment, that different conventions are being contravened, that you think war crimes have been perpetrated. Therefore, what do you think the British government should be doing now alongside other nations?
I think that it should be doing what it actually is to some extent doing, which is to rally international support for a proper respect for international rules governing the conduct of war. I think the British government has acted quite correctly in sanctioning 2 cabinet ministers. I think that other cabinet ministers have as much to answer for as Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir. But I also think that the time has come to recognise a Palestinian state. Traditionally, the British approach to recognition of states has not depended on whether we approve of those states. It's depended on whether they are actually state-like, whether they have the basic characteristics of states in governing a particular territory, in looking after the welfare of their people, and so on. By that standard, both the West Bank and Gaza are either separate Palestinian states or part of the same Palestinian state. It doesn't matter. A two-state solution is ultimately the only solution to this really serious crisis in the Middle East.
And yet the prospect of a two-state solution has never felt, I think, further away. I mean, just on practical terms, how do you think that they will ever get to a two-state solution when there's so much animosity between the two sides, between Hamas and between Netanyahu's government? I mean, I think many of us believe that a two-state solution is the only way forward, but it feels like that's almost an impossible dream right now, Lord Sumption.
Well, that's not a reason why the British government should refrain from advocating it. I think that it would be a step in the right direction.
But it would it actually do anything? The British government can say all it likes. Okay, we recognise, but if Netanyahu isn't essentially going to give ground on this, and he doesn't really want a two-state solution, then the whole thing is kind of stuck.
Well, that's quite right, and I'm not suggesting that it's possible for even the whole international community.
Also, Hamas doesn't really want a two-state solution either, I don't think.
Well, I dare say, but I think Hamas would like to have a recognition of the independence of Palestine from Israel and its state-like characteristics. But I don't actually think it matters what Hamas wants. The rest of the international community needs to stand up for civilized values. Now, I quite agree that they can't impose civilized values on Mr. Netanyahu. But it is fair to say that Israel has an important liberal tradition. I do not suppose that the population, that the electorate of Israel feel very comfortable about Israel becoming a pariah state. There is, as there always is in wartime, a considerable amount of support for the government in the current crisis, but I suspect that the more outrageously the Netanyahu government behaves, the more likely it is that there will be effective criticism of that government when the next election comes round.
And final question to you, given that you argue that war crimes are happening, should the British government and indeed other governments stop selling arms to Israel?
Yes, of course they should. But I mean, they have already embargoed arms sales in a number of categories, and it's not entirely clear how those particular categories were chosen. However, you have to bear in mind that Britain is a very, very minor supplier of arms to Israel. The arms imports from into Israel come almost entirely from the United States and from Germany. And so even the total ban on arms sales to Israel by Britain would make very little difference. That's not a reason for not doing it, but it is a reason for being cautious about what you can expect to happen as a result.